Okay, great. We're live on YouTube as well, so we have a new feature, I think, as part of the webinar program. So welcome everyone to the webinar series of the UK Climate Resilience Programme. It's my great pleasure to have here today Professor Richard Betts from the University of Exeter and the Met Office, and Kathryn Brown from the Committee on Climate Change to come and talk to us about the third climate change risk assessment, both the technical report that Richard led on and also the advice report that Kathryn has led on. So some of you will be returning to the seminar series, so you will be aware of how we engage. We have this Q&A box, which you can find on the Zoom toolbar. Do post your questions there. A colleague of ours is about to post the questions that some of you submitted when you registered, so feel free, you can upvote those questions if you like the look of them, and you can obviously write your own. Usually attendees will remain muted. If we have time, I might be able to enable people to ask questions directly, but obviously if there's a lot of questions, we'll have to use, I'll channel them to our speakers. As usual, we're recording this, and so it's being live streamed on YouTube, and we'll put it on the YouTube channel afterwards. So do use the chat function if you do have any technical problems, and one of our colleagues will try to help you there. And feel free to use the hashtags there at the bottom and the Twitter handle. So before I give the floor to Richard, I do want to have a few quick announcements from the program. One of them is around the UK socioeconomic scenarios, known as UK SSPs. So this is a project that we funded on the program, and it's just finished very recently. And so if you go to our program webpage here at the bottom, you can actually now find all the outputs from the program. So this includes short videos describing what future UK could look like between now and the end of the century. You can have semi-quantitative trends as well around GDP, population, a whole raft of different indicators, and some of them are also spatially explicit. And you can actually look at some of the influence between the drivers of socioeconomic change. So go and have a look. There's quite a lot of data and information there that people can actually now start using them to do climate change risk assessments going forward. The other thing I wanted to highlight briefly was that the British Standards Institution is running a webinar on adaptation pathways. This is a new standard that's come out, and actually a member of the Committee on Climate Change will introduce that webinar. It'll include other people who have been involved in the program, Tim Reeder, and other various colleagues. So do check that out. This could become a very important standard to be utilized in practice, and also obviously informed by research. And then the final thing is that this week, London Climate Action Week is ongoing, and the Met Office and the London Climate Change Partnership this afternoon are running an event on prototyping an urban climate service. So you're still on time to attend. The link is there on the bottom if you'd like to join. Do subscribe. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard to first take us through the technical report. It's over 1,500 pages, and I'm sure he'll point us in the direction of the website a bit later. But I think without further ado, I'll hand over to you to take over, Richard, and tell us more about the third climate change risk assessment technical report.
Okay, thanks, Suraje, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak and share this enormous piece of work with everyone. And this will only be a brief snapshot, of course, as well, because, as you say, it's a huge report. But we'll give you a more in-depth introduction than was available at the launch event. I'm sure many people in the audience will have seen the launch event, but we'll give a bit more detail anyway. So as Suraje pointed out, I'll be talking about the technical report, and Kathryn will talk about the advice report. I'll explain what these are in a minute. But just to give a bit of background about the whole thing, the excuse me, the UK climate change risk assessment process is motivated by the Climate Change Act, which which requires the government to lay before Parliament a report on the risks of climate change to the UK every 5 years. So this is a statutory requirement. And they ask for advice from the Climate Change Committee to prepare that report, who in turn ask relevant experts to provide the technical detail to underpin that. And just to explain the structure, what goes into to the report itself. It's actually a large set of many different reports. At the heart of it is the technical report, which is Suraje said I was leading on, which is written by a large team of relevant experts, and that feeds into the advice report, which is the Climate Change Committee's official advice to government. But all that is underpinned by a vast array of other research. Much of it is actually from the existing literature. So there's a huge amount of literature which is assessed to go into this, but there's also some commissioned research done especially for the report. So unlike the previous CCRA report, there was a large amount of extra research done especially for this. And on the left, the box shows some of the reports which were done especially for this. So one on flooding risk, one on water availability, wildfire risks, impacts of climate change on land use and emissions, thresholds in the climate system, tipping points in the Earth system, which is an important new area, assessment of human behaviour and how that affects responses and adaptation to climate change, interactions between risks, new scenarios, socioeconomic scenarios to underpin it, an extensive report on economic valuation, comparison of the new and old climate projections, and a report on accessibility of the information itself. So all that has fed in to the technical report. A lot of the climate science is based on the UK CP18 projections, the new climate projections produced by my colleagues at the Met Office. And that's a very extensive and complex package of information. We've used all products from UK CP18 in one way or another, actually. But we also used other scenarios as well, because a lot of the impact and risk literature uses the previous projections from UK CP09 and others from other institutions around the world. So it's a very complex, but also sort of it's not a sort of systematic review with one set of projections. It does draw on all the available information, and as well as using research on the impacts and risks area, we also rely on research on adaptation as well, because a lot of the key point is to inform adaptation. That does require, and it does involve information from the literature on adaptation, but also a lot of stakeholder engagement, because a lot of the adaptation is done by government departments, for example, or utility companies, industry, and those stakeholders were involved in this as well. And then the final outputs of these technical and advice reports, then also national summaries and fact sheets as well. So a huge amount of information presented in various ways. The technical report itself, that took us 2.5 years to write, starting at the end of 2018. There were 14 lead authors on that, 42 contributing authors bringing their various specific bits of expertise, 17 what we call additional contributors, so members of an advisory panel and also members of the Climate Change Committee Secretariat team as well, led by Kathryn. The whole thing is nearly 1,500 pages, and there's nearly 3,000 references in that. So quite a big volume of work. And these are the lead authors, the chapter leads. Some of them may be in the audience, so hello if you are. Thank you very much again for your incredible contributions to this. So you'll recognise many of the names and faces, all experts in their own field. And the key point is it's very multidisciplinary. I'm a climate scientist myself, but there's people with expertise in biodiversity, agriculture, economics, health, impacts on infrastructure, many other areas. And it's not just academics, there's also people involved in consultancy companies as well. So quite a range of different backgrounds there. So the key question that we're being asked, that we're addressing is, so based on the latest understanding of current and future risks and opportunities from climate change and the vulnerability and adaptation, what should the priorities be for the next National Adaptation Programme? So a UK level government programme on adaptation and the adaptation programmes of the devolved administrations, so the governments of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And that makes it a bit different to the IPCC report, for example, because it is actually a sort of very policy-focused question, and it's actually asking for advice to inform action directly, rather than just saying what is the problem and what are the general solutions like IPCC would do. So it's a rather different process, in fact. And to answer this question, we identify a comprehensive set of risks which are known to be of concern to the relevant policymakers. And as I said earlier, they're involved directly in producing this. And then we assess the urgency of additional adaptation for each of those risks. So by knowing which ones are more urgent for adaptation and which are less urgent, that can help with the prioritization. So the risks that we looked at, we identified 61 risks in consultation with the relevant stakeholders. And they were categorized into 5 different areas: natural environment and assets, which had 18 risks, infrastructure, which had 13 risks, and opportunities included in this as well. Health, communities, built environment, 13 risks or opportunities. Business and industry had 7 risks or opportunities, and international dimensions had 10. I keep mentioning opportunities because there are some opportunities from climate change to the UK, although they're vastly outweighed by the risks. So generally we talk about risks, but bearing in mind there's a few opportunities within that as well. And some examples of some of the specific risks. So in the natural environment, one of the risks was risk to agriculture from pests, pathogens and invasive species. In infrastructure, it was risk to infrastructure services from river and surface water flooding is one example. Risk to health and well-being from high temperatures, an example of the health communities and built environment area. For business, risk to business from water scarcity. And international dimensions, risk to the UK from international violent conflict resulting from climate change impacts overseas. So the international chapter is about how climate change elsewhere in the world affects the UK. So that gives you a flavour of the kind of risks we were looking at. There were 61 in all. And we went through a method which involved 3 steps for assessing the urgency of adaptation. The first step is to ask what is the current and future level of risk or opportunity. The second is having established that for each risk, we ask, is that risk or opportunity being managed with current adaptation? And if it isn't, then we ask, are there benefits of further adaptation action in the next 5 years? And at the end of that process, we're in a position to categorize the risks according to the urgency of additional action, either with 2 categories of more urgent action. So the most urgent would be more action needed. So we are sure that more needs to be done on adapting to climate change within the next 5 years. Or there's further investigation where we can't say that we are happy that current adaptation is good enough, but we're not clear about what action is needed specifically. So that's still where more needs to be done, and we can't say that we are adapted to that risk if we're under that further investigation category. Or on the less urgent side, we can say that yes, current action is adequate and that should just be sustained, or we can assign a watching brief. So it's an issue that perhaps doesn't need additional work at the moment, but it's to be kept on the radar for future assessment. And we do all of those for the 4 UK countries, or we look at it for the UK as a whole for the international risks. One of the key questions with the first step is to do with framing the current and future level of risk. So for the current risk, we look at current climate and current levels of adaptation, but also situations without any adaptation at all, when some adaptation has been put in place already. But for the future risk, that's more tricky because it's obviously it's not an easy question as to what future climate change we should be adapting to, because it depends on not only the response of climate to our ongoing future emissions. So it's not only a physical science question, it also depends on our own influence of the ongoing human emissions and what level we can expect those to be at. So that makes it quite a complex picture to try and boil down in a simplistic way to make clear policy relevant recommendations. So we look at 2 broad scenarios for future risk. One where we essentially ask what's kind of minimum level of future climate change that we can expect, even if the world does succeed with putting in place mitigation. And you can say that a reasonable guess for that would be, what if we met the terms of the Paris Agreement? So do we limit warming to 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees global warming above for industrial, aiming for 1.5 degrees, of course. And that rather vague wording in the Paris Agreement means that we can't be sure what a specific minimum level of warming would be, even if policy goals were met. So it's succeeding with Paris would be anywhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Actually, for the purposes of the UK, the uncertainty in regional climate responses to either 1.5 and 2 degrees is probably so large that they overlap a lot. So to keep things simple, we just look at one level of warming by the end of the century, and we just go for 2 degrees global warming at the end of the century with half a degree tolerance either side, which allows us to bring in several different scenarios that are approximately 2 degree warming scenarios. So our minimum level of warming is roughly 2 degrees global warming played out within the UK by the end of the century. But it's also worth looking at, are we prepared for a failure of the Paris Agreement? What if we continue on our current trajectory? What if there's no more mitigation at all? And that's an even harder question, because we can't even say for sure what our future levels of global emissions are going to be and how climate will respond in the future. If we have high levels of warming, will tipping points kick in and extra feedbacks and so on? So what do we actually say for our future trajectory without mitigation? We looked at different emissions scenarios. Most climate projections are framed at the moment in terms of either the RCPs, represented concentration pathways, or their successors, the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways. The UK CCRA3 projections use the emissions scenarios associated with the RCPs. So there's some important nuances there which we can discuss later. But the key point is there's a whole range of emission scenarios which are in use in the projections. Which ones do we pick? According to the Sixth Carbon Budget, CB6, released last year, the current global ambition would lead to global emissions of just under 3,000 gigatons of CO2 by the end of the century, which is closer to the RCP 4.5 scenario, but between RCP 4.5 and RCP 6.0. But at the moment, if we continue with current emissions, we'd be close to RCP 6.0 emissions. But there's uncertainty in those scenarios. You can't predict emissions well into the future by the end of the century. After about 2030s, although you can look at various energy policy scenarios, after the 2030s, it becomes extremely difficult to be at all confident in that. There's been a nice study done by Jeremy Vogelli and colleagues in 2016 in Nature Climate Change, which I've called R16 here, which framed the current policies in terms of quite a comprehensive assessment of uncertainties. And if you look at that, it turns out that both RCP 4.5 and 6.0 are within the range of consistent with current policies, even adjusting for increased ambition recently. So that allows us to effectively rule out 2.6 and RCP 8.5 as being consistent with current policies, but the other two, RCP 6.0 and RCP 4.5, are within the possibilities with current worldwide policies. So we use that to frame our assessment of future global warming for this assessment. So we, which basically means that anywhere between just over 2 degrees and almost 5 degrees global warming by the end of the century, if you look at a year-by-year basis, is possible, consistent with current policies. So the kind of the conventional wisdom of we're on track for 3 degrees global warming is a vast oversimplification and much too precise. 4 degrees global warming is well within the range of possibilities, it turns out, especially if you include carbon cycle feedbacks in the projections, as the UK CP18 projections do. So our upper scenario is basically a scenario of 4 degrees global warming reached at the end of the century between 2080 and 2100. So that's our upper pathway for the risk assessment. So a few examples of some key risks that we looked at. I won't be able to go through all of them, but one relevant one, especially at the moment, bearing in mind what's happening in North America, is risk to health and well-being from high temperatures. The map on the left shows UK, the anomaly in maximum air temperatures across the UK in the 2080s with 4 degrees warming, RCP 6.0. The key point there being that the local temperature change, especially for extremes, is larger than the global mean warming. So 4 degree global warming means up to 5, 6, 7 degrees, any increase in extreme temperatures in the UK. So that would be lead to an increased risk of deaths under high temperatures. One study which we assessed we projected that the present day heat-related deaths, which is about 2,000 people per year die related to high temperatures, would increase to 7,000 per year under a 2 degree global warming scenario and 13,000 per year in the UK under a 4 degree warming scenario. So that does bring home that high temperatures are a risk to life in the UK if we don't adapt to that. Flooding risk is another area which underpins a lot of the specific risks. So there was a study done looking at both impacts from rainfall, river flooding, surface water flooding, and coastal flooding from sea level rise as well. So one of the underpinning reports which inform many of the risks. The maps here show the projections of the numbers of people exposed to an increased risk of significant risk of flooding at the present day and in the middle of the century on the way to a 2 degree warming pathway, and 2080s on the way to a 4 degree scenario of global warming. And it's with no additional adaptation. And you can see that tens of thousands of people are already at risk of flooding, and tens of thousands more would be at increased risk as we go on with future warming scenarios, especially with the higher warming scenario. So 3 risks that fed into were risk to infrastructure services from surface water flooding, risk to people, communities and buildings from flooding, and risk to businesses from flooding. And all of those were assessed as more action needed on adaptation. A final example is that a cross-cutting risk, which is also an emergent risk for the UK, is the risk of wildfire, We do get fires in the UK, but nowhere near as severe as those we see in other parts of the world. However, at high levels of global warming, especially 4 degrees warming, we would expect many more days, especially in summer, to have fire weather categorized as very high risk. So if an ignition occurs, then it's there's a very high risk of it turning into a very severe or even catastrophic fire. So fire risk becomes much more of a concern under a hotter and drier climate in the UK than it has previously. And that's an example of cascading risks as well. One of the underpinning reports looked at interacting risks and how one risk leads to other knock-on risks. So we've got a few of these very complex diagrams which trace through a hierarchy and a cascade of risks which interact with each other. So wildfire is one, but there was others as well. So it's just to say that these risks don't occur in isolation. They do affect each other and have a domino effect in many cases. And that was taken into account in this report, which is another important step. So what does the big picture result then? What does it look like in terms of how well we're adapted? Which risks are we prepared for? Hardly any is actually the answer, broadly speaking. Only 7 of the 61 risks or opportunities were scored as sustaining current action or watching brief. 31 of the 61 risks were scored as more action needed. So those are where we are sure that more needs to be done within the next 5 years. So more than half the risks definitely need more action. And the remainder were assessed as further investigation needed. So we can't say that we are adapted, but we are not clear about what needs to be done exactly to increase the adaptation. So to summarize then, the Paris Agreement goal would limiting warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming. That could be the minimum we can expect. So hence adaptation will be needed to at least that level of warming. But if we fail on Paris, up to 4 degrees global warming is possible this century. That's within the range consistent with current worldwide policies. So assessing adaptation to that is therefore a prudent measure. In the technical report for the CCRA3, we assessed 61 specific risks which were identified in consultation with relevant stakeholders and decision makers. And of those, only 7 will be managed with current adaptation, and more than half need more action on adaptation. And I'll finish there and hand over to Kathryn.
Thanks very much, Richard, and hi everybody. So I'm just going to follow along from Richard's presentation to give you a bit of a taste of the advice report, which is the other half of the major outputs from the assessment itself. And I've had a look at who's here, and I know a lot of you already, but for those who haven't met me before, I'm the head of adaptation at the Climate Change Committee. And I sort of had a dual role on the assessment. So part of it was coordinating the whole assessment itself, but I was also the lead author on the advice report. So I'll just take you through some of that now. And the first thing to say is that the advice report sort of had 2 roles. So one was to try to look across all of the work that went into the technical report and all of the other underpinning reports as well that Richard showed in his first slide, and to think about what are some of the key overarching messages that we wanted to bring out to try and summarize some of that. So I'll take you through a few of those, starting with this one, which I'll explain in a minute. And then the other part of it was the committee, the adaptation committee of the CCC needs to give government statutory advice on what this all means for future national adaptation planning. So I'll take you through that as well. So first, just a couple of slides to take you through some of the summarizing of the technical report. So we looked at different aspects like how is risk changing over time, what do costs and benefits look like over time, and I'll try and pick up a few of the Q&A as I go through this as well. So this first slide is just showing you, when you look across all of those 61 risks and opportunities that Richard showed, what does the size of the risk in the absence of additional adaptation look like going into the future in both the 2 degree scenario and the 4 degree scenario that Richard introduced? And this chart just shows you the results of that. So the present day risk and opportunity levels are on the left-hand bar there, and you can see that The high risk magnitude, which is an annual cost in the hundreds of millions of pounds or more as an annual average, that's kind of our baseline level for the high risk. About 15 of the risks, just less than that, we're given that high magnitude score. But if you look at the change, even in the 2-degree scenario, so the low scenario that we use, the most ambitious scenario, by the 2050s, we're still seeing nearly a doubling of that. And if you look at the 4-degree scenario by the 2080s, the last bar here on the right, you can see there's a huge increase in the number of high magnitude risks. But the point here is really that we still need adaptation. We need additional adaptation, even in this very ambitious mitigation scenario, the 2-degree scenario. So it is not the case that we don't need to adapt to the 2-degree level of warming. The 4-degree level of warming looks fairly catastrophic in a lot of places, and that's definitely a world we don't want to be in. But as Richard explained, we have to look across the range of risk that is still within the likely range. So we've tried to do that here. And just to say as well, Richard mentioned opportunities, and we did look at those as well. And we've done the same assessment, looking at how the level of opportunity changes through time as well. Although, as you can see, they're far fewer than the number of risks. This is doing the same thing, but just looking at the economic costs of the different risks. And this is from Paul Watkins's valuation report that he put together with Alistair Hunt and Federica Samato. And this is showing just in the 2-degree scenario how the damage costs increase through time. And this introduces a new very high category, which is annual damages in the billions of pounds or higher. And again, as you can see, even in the 2-degree scenario, we're getting a tripling of damage costs by the 2080s, again, highlighting the need for adaptation, even in the low scenario, let alone the high scenario. Again, we've done the same thing for opportunities. And the other thing to highlight here is this unknown bar at the end, which, given that the risk assessment was largely based on a literature review, although, as we've explained, we did manage to fund some new analysis, including the flood projections that Paul Sayers put together, and the water projections as well that H.R. Wallingford led on. A lot of these risks, we can't cost these impacts into the future. And in particular, a lot of the risks in the natural environment fell into that category where we just don't know how the economic damages increase into the future. And that's partly the reason we haven't been able to do a percentage of GDP cost from climate change in the risk assessment, because there are so many gaps in our understanding of how these costs fall. And I'll come back to that briefly at the end. The other thing we looked at was a comparison since the last risk assessment. And this is just one chart that we've done, but there's a few more. There's a section in the advice report that just goes through this, if any of you are particularly interested to see how things have changed through time. And this is looking at the change in the urgency scores. So as a percentage of the total number of risks, there were actually slightly fewer risks assessed in CCRA2, but they were roughly the same number. So we've looked at percentage here. And as you can see, the number that are falling into the more action needed category, the one on the left here, over half of the risks, as Richard showed, are now falling into this category compared to only about a third in CCRA2. And this is part of the reason behind our headline message that not only are we not prepared for inevitable climate change, but actually the gap between the level of risk as we assess it in the future and the level of adaptation underway has widened since CCRA2, which is obviously quite a worrying finding. So that just gives you a little taste of some of the summarising we've done, but there's a lot more of it in the advice report. And then just looking at the committee's advice, what they've done with all of that analysis briefly. So this chart is the main one that we focused on in the launch of the risk assessment itself. And this gives you the 8 key areas that the committee highlighted to government as needing the most urgent action in the next 2-year period. So this is before the next set of national adaptation plans are published. And 4 of those risks were related to the natural environment. These little bar wedges are just showing how the magnitude of the risk changes through time in the absence of additional adaptation again. So risks to terrestrial and freshwater habitats and species, risks to soil health, to natural carbon stores, including peatlands, and risks to agriculture and forestry productivity. And then another 4 from other parts of the technical report, so risks to supply chains, including food, but other goods and services as well. Risks to people from climate-related failure of the power system. So this is power outages caused by extreme weather. And in particular, the committee highlighted this one because of the increasing dependence we expect to see on the electricity system as we transition to net zero, so that these impacts, when we see them on the electricity system, when there are outages, the impact of that will be much wider than it might have been in the past. And the last two, risks to human health from overheating, again, a very relevant topic, sadly, at the moment. And this has been a key risk in every risk assessment since the UK started doing them 10 years ago. So from CCRA1 and CCRA2, this is still a major risk area where we're not yet seeing the level of policy that we would expect given the size of the risk. And then a last one, which came from the international chapter of the CCRA, which is about a sort of COVID parallel, but driven by climate change, about multiple cascading risks from climate change impacts overseas, and how those can cascade across different sectors and different regions, which is obviously a very high risk in the future and very difficult to predict in quantitative terms accurately. And really the reason these 8 were picked out was partly because there are big policy decisions coming up in the next 2 years where adaptation should be integrated. Also where obviously the level of urgency in the assessment was high, and where the adaptation gap was deemed to be particularly significant. But what I wanted to focus on a bit more today, just taking it a bit further than what we looked at in the launch, is just to look at this second part of the committee's advice to government. And this is on how you do good adaptation, how you do adaptation well. Again, looking across the technical report and all of the analysis to think about some of the cross-cutting issues that were coming out of it. And this has a lot of parallels with climate change mitigation. So if you think about the level of debate that goes on about things like how we do offsetting properly, this is a very similar idea, but for adaptation. But these issues have had a lot less attention in the last 5 years across government than maybe they could do or should do in the future. So we had 10 principles which are on the slide. I won't read them all out to you, but I just wanted to pick up on some of those as I go through the next few slides. And there is a section on each of these in the advice report to explain why they're so important for adaptation planning. So one that, one that we looked at was about integrating adaptation into other policies. This was just a quick look we did across 15 relevant climate-related policy announcements, either by the UK government or separately for England and the devolved administrations over the last 2 to 3 years, only 4 of which, the ones on the right-hand side, had actually integrated adaptation effectively into the policy itself. So we saw another bunch, which are the middle bunch, which had adaptation mentioned, but the fact that adaptation is needed in order to meet that policy goal in the first place wasn't really articulated, or there weren't particularly specific actions that enabled adaptation to happen. And then there are some on the left where adaptation wasn't included at all, even though you would expect it to. And this is something we'll come back to in our work to scrutinise government progress on adaptation in the future as well. Another, again, very relevant this week at the moment, seeing what's happening in Canada and the US, is this idea of avoiding lock-in and coming back to the key risk about overheating. This is some of the weather maps that the Met Office produced from last summer, looking at how severe the heat wave was in August, which I'm sure you all remember, particularly those of you living in the southeast of England. And these are 6 consecutive days where the maximum temperature was 10 degrees or more higher than the average. And we've been saying for a long time and recommending to government that they need to think about these future extreme temperatures and current extreme temperatures in building design, in neighbourhood planning, because we're seeing houses being built, we're seeing whole communities being developed without thinking about these future conditions, and we're locking in, therefore, that risk into the future. It's very expensive to go back and retrofit some of these adaptation measures like passive cooling at a later date, probably 4 or 5 times more expensive if you look at some of the analysis we've done for housing in particular. So that's something, this idea of avoiding lock-in, that we've tried to bring out more strongly in this assessment compared to previous versions. Another example is understanding threshold effects. This little thermometer chart is just showing some of the thresholds that were picked out of the analysis. And again, there's a supporting report that was led by UK CEH looking at thresholds in the natural environment. And the point of highlighting this really is that when we think about adaptation options, we don't just want to think about changes in average conditions. quite often the point at which you need to do something different, or you need a completely different way of looking at the risk, happens when you pass a specific threshold. A lot of these are a natural environment, but there were quite a few thresholds in the infrastructure chapter in particular as well, and really across all of the chapters of the technical report. But again, in national adaptation planning, particularly at the central government level, we don't often see recognition of these threshold effects and how big a change you can get in the risk once you've passed a threshold. So that's something that we wanted to highlight much more. And coming back to one of the other questions in the Q&A, we also have a section in the advice report on addressing inequalities, both as an adaptation response to the risk where climate change is impacting disproportionately on different groups, but also thinking about it in terms of how you do adaptation well to make sure you're not increasing inequality through ineffective decisions. So this little Venn diagram chart is just showing some of the different aspects of inequalities that were picked up across the report. And for every one of the 61 risks and opportunities, there was a section on inequalities, as well as actually a section on thresholds and a section on addressing net zero as well. So there's aspects of exposure, things like location, adaptive capacity, so income and assets, and how able different groups and different communities are to help themselves without government intervention, and then aspects of demographics, which are probably the best known ones, so things like age, gender, ethnic minorities. So again, Paul Sayers has done a follow-up project looking at flood risk across different ethnic minority groups in cities, and there is a very clear link there that isn't then linked to other aspects of demographics. So that's quite an interesting piece of follow-up work that's been done. And finally, coming back to opportunities, so we've mentioned this a few times, and we were keen to make sure that the assessment was as balanced as possible. So we did want to look at the opportunities from climate change as well as the risks. And as Richard's stressed, there are far fewer of these, and they are unlikely to be met if the risks are not addressed, because often they are linked together. But it is important to think about these as well, and they do fall across, again, all of the different chapters. So there's opportunities for, if we deal the risks to soil and water quality and quantity, there may be opportunities for things like increased agricultural output from longer growing seasons. There's very likely to be quite a sizable benefit to health and an economic benefit from reduced winter heating costs as well. And there's a few new ones that came out as well, things like discovering previously unknown heritage, which sometimes during a heat wave, you can actually see patterns in dried out soil showing you something that's buried underneath. So there's quite an interesting array of different opportunities across the assessment. And then finally, just to finish up on, we also then had a section on the costs and benefits of adaptation. And again, this is drawing largely from the valuation report that Paul Watkins put together. But the point being made here is that we know that adaptation is very cost beneficial in a lot of cases. It can be quite hard to come up with single numbers because the costs and benefits often vary quite significantly depending on the location and the specifics of the risk you're looking at. But if you just look at this chart, everything is on the right to the one-to-one line, and some of these measures we know we've got good evidence for have benefit cost ratios well in excess of 10-1, which is a hugely cost beneficial. And just to say, there is a follow-up study that DEFRA are funding at the moment, which is being led by Frontier Economics and Paul Watkins as well, to take this a step further and look more at the damage costs from climate change and the benefits of further action. So we're hoping that study is going to be published next year sometime. And for those of you that are interested in this in particular, that will be a good one to watch out for. So I'll stop there and pass back to Suraje to do Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kathryn and Richard, for summarizing a huge amount of work in such a short space of time. And thanks everyone for the questions you've posed already. Keep them coming. I'm going to kickstart with some methodological questions that people have put here, which I think would be really useful to answer first. So let's start with Timothy Lamb's question here. And Richard, this one's for you. Is there a scoring system to determine the action capacity gaps, or are they subjective?
So there's a scoring system for the magnitude of the risks. There's a very clear set of criteria for whether the magnitude is low, medium, or high. There isn't a scoring system for the adaptation gap. That is subjective, down to expert judgment, really. And that's where a lot of the debate happened, an intense discussion amongst the authors and other expert advisors as well, to make sure that this kind of expert judgment is robust. But there's not really a way to properly quantify and objectively quantify it, unfortunately. So it does come down to expert judgment in the end. Yeah.
Can I just add a bit to that, Suraje, as well? I mean, one of the ways we try to get around that is through having such an extensive review process. And as well as 3,000 references, we also had 5,000 review comments across the whole report. I know Elisa is in the audience, and she had to dealing with a lot of those. So it was a massive job. But part of the reason for doing that is so that we can test all of this expert judgment. So we had reviewers across government, external reviewers, peer reviewers, which Nigel Arnell led a panel of peer reviewers. So that's part of the transparency part of the assessment as to how we do that adaptation assessment.
Thank you. Peter Watson has got a question about the climate model output and how it's used. So he's asking about, if actual climate change is considerably outside the range of what the models predict. So with a jet stream, for example, behavior changing by a large factor, causing much larger changes. I mean, is that considered in the report? And if so, I guess he's sort of questioning whether the risks can be underestimated by these issues. But I know you folks actually did a bunch of work on tipping points in particular, so yes. I'm sure you clarify.
Yeah, that's a really great question to have been asked, and also it links to Stephen Wade's similar kind of question about sort of are we underestimating the risk by focusing on 4 degrees as well. And I wanted to mention that because Stephen obviously did, well, people may know he did the job I've just done for the first CCRA 10 years ago. So hi Stephen, and thanks for joining us and asking the question. So both those questions about could we be underestimating the risk with this methodology and reliance on climate models? Potentially we could. So we do try to account for that, as Suraje said. We don't just stick rigidly to 4 degrees warming in our entire assessment. That's a framing for our sort of formal assessment of the adaptation, but we do an assessment of low probability, high impact risks as well, which could be higher rates of warming, which could result from higher emissions scenarios if we sort of went backwards in policy, or if feedbacks in the climate system are stronger than expected, if major tipping points are passed, more carbon release from permafrost, for example, or shifts in the climate system, such as shutdown of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, or shifts in monsoons, or El Nino, and so on. So we kind of more informally kind of look at a kind of what if scenario for those kind of things in a kind of stress testing kind of way to see, is this advice likely to be changed if any of those things happen. In many cases, if you've got to the assessment of high magnitude of a risk or more action needed, then you've got nowhere else to go. If this impact is more severe, you're already at the highest category. With so many of them in the high category, that's essentially what happens there. But the difficulty is there's little hard evidence to go on in the literature for that. So it's expert judgment on top of expert judgment, really. So it's a long way of saying, yes, we did as much as we could to try and assess these things in the absence of concrete information. So it's definitely not ignored.
Thanks, Richard. If I could just push Kathryn a bit more on this one, because I guess, Steve is sort of saying, we're kind of covering this sort of current ambition to up to 4 degrees, but there is, I guess, in policy terms, there is a risk of being beyond that. So I guess in policy terms, the kind of low likelihood, high impact events, it's sort of things above 4 degrees global warming, which obviously will be bigger, even higher in the UK. I mean, how does that translate policy-wise in terms of policy messages?
Yeah, Yeah, it's a good question from Stephen. In CCRA1, the range that we looked at, that Stephen looked at, was between 1 and 6 degrees. So it has contracted a bit, and there's quite a lively debate, I believe, going on in the IPCC at the moment about what they're going to say about this when the Working Group 1 report is published over the summer. We use 2 and 4 because it is an easy way to communicate what we're talking about to non-climate specialists in government. So we've moved away from using emission scenarios and uncertainty ranges in the committee's work in talking about risk. That's not to say that these are the only possibilities and the space in between. And actually, the tipping point stuff is just as relevant to the 2 degree scenario as it is to the 4 degree or the 4 degree plus, as Richard was saying. You know, we could see tipping points being passed now or at 2 degrees. I mean, it depends which ones you're talking about and the likelihood, obviously, at those rates of warming. But that's worth bearing in mind as well. But we make clear in the report that 4 degrees is not the worst case scenario. I try never to use that phrasing. I think I do slip into it occasionally, but I don't mean to. But it's important to never think about this as a worst case scenario. But also, I mean, at 4 degrees, there are limits. There are likely to be hard limits for what adaptation can do to reduce the risk. You know, you'll get risk escalation for a lot of these risks in the 4 degree scenario, even with very high levels of adaptation. So I guess then there's a question of what is the added benefit of going beyond that if you're looking specifically at adaptation policy, not if you're thinking about the benefits of mitigation, which is a different question.
Thanks, Kathryn. One more methodological question from your colleague, Matthew Palmer, Richard. How's the long-term commitment, how's the sea level rise commitment long-term beyond 2100 accounted for in the risk assessment?
So we do use the UK CP18 marine projections, which include the longer term sea level rise, which Matt obviously led on, and so we do account for that. And although the risk is framed in terms of risks at the mid-century and end of the century, we do also look beyond that for cases when there is a sensitivity to longer term sea level rise. So if infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, for example, needs to have a longer lifetime than just this century, then that is taken into account, and the relevant risks do mention that. So it's certainly not forgotten, especially with the potential for displacement of coast communities in low-lying coastal areas and that kind of thing. These are long-term things, so we definitely don't ignore things beyond 2100.
Okay, thank you. There's a great question here from Greta. What are the main reasons behind the lack of sufficient action being taken by the UK government to address climate change adaptation? Is it lack of understanding of the urgency, indifference, something else? Who'd like to take that one?
Shall I start and then Richard can come in?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen political interest in adaptation wax and wane quite a bit over the last 15 years. And Suraje, you might have quite a lot to say about this one as well, actually, thinking about it. I think there's probably a few reasons. There's definitely a few reasons. One is that it's economically, it's less interesting politically in 5-year timescales to look at adaptation because the benefits often accrue over longer timescales than the costs, which are upfront. So it can be a more tricky economic argument to make to someone who is only interested in a 5-year timescale. I'm not saying all politicians are, but some of them are. As a lot of you will know, working in adaptation, it's quite processy. So the adaptation principles were our way of trying to make that process side of it a bit clearer to ministers and some officials in government. But it's less easy to see it. And actually, one of the other questions talks about what would a well-adapted UK look like. And that's something we've been recommending strongly that government needs to do, is to come up with a better vision for a well-adapted UK so that we can explain how good that looks to ministers. That's been done quite effectively on net zero. It's not been done very well on adaptation. And there's a psychological problem, I would say, just my personal view, working in adaptation and mitigation for a long time. Adaptation is seen as a failure of mitigation, and actually it is, if you look at it in historic terms. So the inevitable change that we're facing now is as a result of failure to reduce past emissions. But that, again, politically, that can be quite difficult to think about when, particularly, you are very focused on achieving net zero. I think it's probably hardest for those officials and those ministers who are very, very focused on achieving net zero to then also think about adaptation together. It feels incongruous in some ways, and it isn't at all. As we've shown in the risk assessment, you have to do both, and you should be integrating them together. But that has been quite a hard message to get across, and we're still trying to do that in different ways to see if what sticks.
I think if I could also chip in, I think another issue is lack of clarity about whose problem it is to sort it out, whose job it is to sort it out, especially to find the money when a lot of this stuff is very expensive. A very pertinent and urgent example is the issue of coal tips in Wales. This came out during the process of doing the report. There's 2,000 coal tips in Wales. Obviously, there's a horrendous disaster in the 60s, which everyone wants to avoid happening again. But there was a minor landslide last year in one of them, which didn't affect property or people. But an urgent assessment was done by the Welsh government straight away, and 300 of these coal tips were assessed as being at high risk. But it's going to cost £500 million to make them safe. And it's not clear whether the Welsh government or the Westminster government should foot the bill. I think lots of discussions happening in that, so it's not an issue being ignored, but it's a real problem about where the funding comes from and who pays for it. So it's that kind of thing is also an issue, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to put in one final question because it's super interesting and it's a difficult one, but I'm going to press you to try to respond quickly on that one. And that's, what does your assessment say about, can we actually adapt to 4 degrees global warming?
The assessment we've done where we have quantitative information suggests that in the 4-degree scenario, you can still reduce damages. I think certainly in the flooding projections work that Paul did, you can't bring the risk level back down to today's level in that scenario, even with the most adaptation you can throw at the problem. The water projections, I think, were quite similar, but it's actually quite hard to say. Because this is largely a literature review, we still have quite a big evidence gap in understanding what adaptation can achieve in that scenario. And then again, when you bring in the tipping points question, what that scenario might actually look like. So we're fairly sure there are going to be limits and what I mean by limits is you will get an escalation of risk, whatever you do. But that doesn't mean that adaptation is pointless. You can still reduce the risks compared to what they would be otherwise. But understanding that level and what that looks like, I think, still requires quite a bit more research.
I would say it's important to look internationally for that as well. I mean, look, high temperatures in countries that are already hot. I mean, we talked about North America's current experience at the moment, but Pakistan has had temperatures in the 50s recently, and that's very humid as well. 4-degree global warming in the humid regions of the Indian subcontinent. What does adaptation to that actually look like? Utter transformation of societies and so on. If you can call that adaptation, if you never go outside, is that actually adaptation, or is that just, I don't know, what is it? So there's big things like that. This is a really critical question. Can we actually deal with those things at all? Maybe not.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard and Kathryn. Kathryn, could I ask you if you have a plan of further dissemination of CCRA amongst the public, parliamentarians and others? It might be useful for the community to know that.
We're running a series of what we call deep dive workshops in the autumn. So I think we're doing 6 different meetings which are open for public registration to look in a lot more detail at specific sectors across the risk assessment. We're doing a briefing for MPs in the autumn as well. We've already done some. And we're doing deep dive sessions in each of the devolved administrations to get into the question of what then the adaptation response should look like. So those will all be happening in September. But there's loads of material, there's loads of summaries. We haven't talked about summaries very much, but given how much there is, we've tried to summarize it as much as we can. So if you go to the UK Climate Risk website, all of the material is there, apart from the advice report, which is on our website. but do go and have a look, and hopefully you'll find what you're looking for. But we're always around to direct people if they'd like to know about specific things.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, Kathryn, and thanks everyone for attending and for all your questions. We'll pass on these questions to Richard and Kathryn, and we've just published a blog on the CCRA3 and certainly the contributions of the program to CCRA3. So if Kathryn and Richard are able to answer some of those questions, hopefully you can pick that up in the website. So it just to finish off, I just wanted to advertise a couple of our last webinars in the series before the summer break. So we have colleagues from the Met Office to come and talk to us about a national framework for climate services in a couple of weeks' time. And then we have James Cooper from the University of Liverpool coming and talking to us about erosion hazards in river catchments, particularly looking at critical infrastructure. So go to our website and you can register for those webinars. So thanks again for a fascinating run through the CCRA third assessment, Kathryn and Richard. And as Kathryn said, go to the website, UK Climate Risk, to find out more. You've got all the reports, the briefing notes, and the sector briefings and national summaries as well there. And hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks a lot.